Thank you, and hello, everybody. I'm Norma Levy, president of New Plaza Cinema. We're a nonprofit organization, and today we'll be discussing a 1950 heist film noir directed by John Huston and starring Shirley Hayden and Lewis Calhern. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this over to our film historian, Max Alvarez. Max?
Thank you, Norma, and welcome everyone to this online edition of New Plaza Cinema. Gary Palmucci, our film programmer, is with me today, but we're going to be channeling the spirit of 1940s suspense radio. Gary, we don't have video for Gary, but we do have audio, which is so important because Gary knows so much about cinema. So we'll be hearing Gary today, although we won't be seeing him. So I want to welcome Gary in voice to this talk back on New Plaza Cinema. Great to hear you, Gary.
All right, well, thank you, Max. I'm coming to you today from the projection booth of New Plaza Cinema, where we sometimes have this program. But even though we're in the projection booth, there is no picture. There is only sound. But be that as it may, it's appropriate, I think, for a classic film noir. Now, before we started, our colleague Lori was talking about some of the knowledge or lack thereof of film history and context and so forth among some of her film students. And I was thinking to myself, how would you explain a director like John Huston in the time in which he worked in terms that today's film students and film lovers would understand? And I think that one way we could look at Huston is to say that really Huston was the grandfather or perhaps the godfather of several generations of iconoclastic, independent-minded filmmakers who managed to keep one or both feet in the studio system for much of their career. People like in the 60s, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur Penn, Sam Peckinpah. In the 70s, Robert Altman, Marty Scorsese, Francis Coppola. And more recently, some of the younger directors that are worthy of our admiration, like Wes Anderson, Paul Thomas Anderson, Alexander Payne, David O. Russell, if he doesn't punch anybody out on the set. And even I think Huston did a little of that too in his day. But if you can make those correlations, I think you'll get an idea of the sort of man and the sort of artist that he was in his time, fighting a number of obstacles that in their own way all those filmmakers had to contend with in their day. I first saw, in fact, the only time I'd seen the Asphalt Jungle prior to this week was in the late 70s at the late lamented Carnegie Hall Cinema, which some of you may remember, on a double feature with another Huston classic, The Treasure of Sierra Madre. It holds up beautifully, beautifully bleak, as Matt and I were discussing earlier today. And Max, you have an original trailer to show us, yes?
I do, Gary. This is an original trailer from 1950, put out by MGM, which we have a lot to talk about. Not your typical studio that you would associate with a gritty crime picture like this, but things were changing at the studio. We'll talk more about that.
Only the author of Little Caesar could tell so dramatic a story. Only the director of The Treasure of Sierra Madre could film it with such power. Only once in a decade does the screen come up with such absorbing characters. Sterling Hayden as Dix Handley, a hooligan with a twisted dream. Jean Hagen as Doll, the dime-a-dance dame who wanted to share that shabby dream.
Let me go with you. Please, Dix, please.
Are you crazy? I'm on the lam. I want it bad, packing heat. If there's any trouble, what good would you be?
I could drive.
No. I'm wanted on a killing rap. You know what that means.
I don't care. I just want to be with you.
Lewis Calhern as Emmerich, the big-time mouthpiece with crime on his mind.
Oh, I suppose a fella should stick to his own trade, but I know some pretty big men around here that might not be averse to a deal like this if they're properly approached. Highly respectable men, I might add.
Sam Jaffe as Doc. He's got $1 million in that little black bag, and a jitterbug cost him every dime. Marilyn Monroe as Angela, the easy-living, green-eyed blonde.
Haven't you bothered me enough, you big banana head? Just try breaking my door, and Mr. Emmerich will throw you out of the house.
James Whitmore as Gus, the strong-arm boy. A right guy in a wrong world.
Come on! You ain't breaking loose! You haven't seen him or anything! You're gonna wind up with your paralysis! You're gonna wind up in a morgue!
Excuse me, 80 minutes of continuous excitement? This movie runs 112 minutes.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
very confused by that critic's quote.
that's baffling.
And it's fascinating they got a quote in from Richard Brooks, who was just starting to, that year, become a director in his own right. And what's also fascinating is we hear the Miklos Rosa score, because the only time we hear it is at the beginning and the end, right? Because
Yes.
there's no music throughout the rest of the movie, which is a bold decision, and I'm surprised that the studio went along with it, because had it been made at Warner Brothers under Hal Wallace, it would have been wall-to-wall music, and yet there's no music once the story begins.
Yes, our beloved friend there who wrote the book on the composer Max Steiner, who joined us recently. That that would never have happened under his watch.
Precisely, but it's fascinating because you do concentrate more, I think. And maybe now that I think about it, because Gary, before we were beginning this presentation, you and I were talking a little bit about the film, and I was unprepared by how bleak and difficult the Asphalt Jungle is. I mean, it's really a psychologically stressful film to watch, and I'm starting to think that the absence of a music score almost gives it a more you are there feel. I mean, we're there observing. We don't have music to remind us maybe who we're supposed to sympathize with, who's more menacing, what is going to happen that could be problematic. We have to just watch what's going on with the characters. And I love music scores, but it does make this viewing experience a little different from other crime pictures I've seen. I'm thinking of this on the spot, by the way. You may disagree.
Well, there's something, like you said, there's an intimacy. Somehow you get closer to every one of those rooms or those sets or those characters, I think, without the music score. And you realize at a certain point that there is no score. You know, well, a good 15 or 20 minutes of the picture, and there may not be until of course the memorable very last shot, which is maybe one of the two or three things that I could remember from the film, having seen it over 40 years ago now. The final shot, the famous jitterbug number in the cafe with our safecracker friend, and the line when Sterling Hayden says, "That bullet just passed through me and went on about its business," which is a typical Sterling Hayden line.
Yeah, there were so many memorable lines, and this really was Sterling Hayden's breakthrough film role after being put in just some cursory features. We'll talk more about Sterling Hayden. I do want to continue some of your thoughts on John Huston, because you did ask a question, how would you position John Huston to contemporary of audiences? He was in many ways how can I say, not the legit, but the more Hollywood-friendly version of Orson Welles. I mean, they were very similar in age. They were good friends. But Huston navigated the system a little better. He was able to navigate the Hollywood system to his own advantages better than Welles was.
They both broke through with their first films the same year, 1941.
Exactly.
Citizen Kane and the Maltese Falcon.
Exactly, and we're both very much involved in the screenwriting of their films, and this, I mean, you can't overstate the extraordinary aspect of this. But not only Welles, but Huston pretty much made a mockery of the theme that you can't make a great film out of great literature. I mean, yes, The Asphalt Jungle is not a particularly well-known literary source, but he went on to make extremely important films by towering literary sources. towards the last few decades of his career, proving that, yes, you can make a great film from a great novel if you're a director who knows what he or she is doing. And that's another thing that stood out. Huston was often negotiating with the Hollywood system to make something that was more personal to him, and in exchange for something that was more commercial. In the case of the Asphalt Jungle, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Gary, but there was one writer, I think it was James Nairmore, who's written about film noir, mentioned that the Asphalt Jungle was really a closing chapter to Huston's more political films that came out of the 1940s. I mean, you don't really associate a lot of those films with being political, but we think about, I mean, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre is a political film. It deals with greed and the profit system destroying the human condition. Key Largo, his noir with Bogart and Edward G. Robinson and Bacall 2 years earlier, was political, in many ways commenting on some of the political pressures Hollywood was going through at the time. The Edward G. Robinson character is this very unscrupulous business-related gangster. And then you have, he made We Were Strangers.
Set in Cuba, I believe, right?
I'm sorry?
Set in Cuba, I believe, right?
Set in Cuba, a very underrated noir with major political commentary about corruption going on and revolutionaries battling the corruption there. And then you have the Asphalt Jungle. I mean, you have, yes, it's greed and it's people committing crimes for money, but you do have the Louis Calhern character who's he's a lawyer, he's the rich guy, and he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. He wants the others to do the dirty work for him. And some people, I guess, like James Nairmore felt, and also Reynold Humphreys, who's written about this era, felt that Huston was withdrawing from some of those maybe clandestine political themes after.
Also Huston was one of those directors, unlike Orson Welles, who was involved in filmmaking on the battlefields of World War II, the famous Battle of San Pietro about the Allied advance in Italy, report from the Aleutians about the deadly boredom of the Air Force guys who were stationed in Alaska, Let There Be Light about the shell shock victims at Creedmoor Hospital in Queens. I mean, that shaped his worldview, I'm sure, like several other directors who went overseas.
Yes, and he had clashed with the U.S. Army and the various Department of War services over those films. Some of the early, the initial ones you mentioned were heavily edited because the Army and other forces felt that, representatives felt that they were too anti-war or showing too much horror of war. And Let There Be Light, as many people are aware, that was shelved or suppressed for 35 years.
That's
not
right.
shown until 1980 because it dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder on the part of veterans.
Finally cleared for legal showings by Vice President Walter Mondale in the waning days of the Carter administration in January of 1981.
So that's the story there.
Yeah.
And what's going on when this film is made? Yes, it's a heist picture, but there's all kinds of political storm clouds hovering over the narrative. And 3 years before the film came out, you did have the first round of House Committee on Un-American Activities hearings in Washington, D.C., where the film community was put on trial, the Hollywood 10. You had two divided groups, those supporting the committee in their supposed anti-communist objectives, which included MGM chief Louis B. Mayer, who hated the Asphalt Jungle. He hated movies like this. He didn't want it to be made. It was Dory Sherry, who was part of the more liberal Hollywood corner, that was a great believer in the project. And
well, he or somebody at MGM, Sherry or someone else, had to tell Mr. Mayer that the taste of the American public had changed somewhat since the heyday of Mayer's tenure at MGM, where the Andy Hardy films and the musicals and the light comedies were standard fare of the studio. But after World War II, audiences were more receptive to more hard-nosed treatments of crime pictures and pictures of all different sorts that comprised the noir genre. And he left the studio, I think, not long after the Asphalt Jungle was released. Right?
Later. And I think the last movie he greenlit was Singing in the Rain, which you and I have discussed in the past. But there's all kinds of, so you're, yes, so that's a perfect example of the changing times that MGM had to adapt to. John Huston had been part of the committee for the First Amendment that went to Washington with, these were liberals in Hollywood who were protesting the fact that more radical members of the community were being put under the, grilled and pressured by the HUAC committee. And
Now,
then
refresh my memory, Max. Was Houston himself ever called before HUAC to
he
testify?
was not. He was not. However, I mean, he was very disenchanted and disgusted with what had happened as a result of that, and he did end up leaving the United States and actually getting Irish citizenship in the early '60s because he felt that the era that we call the McCarthy era, or it was more than McCarthy behind it, had just changed the America that he knew. And apparently he did sort of have to sort of make nice with some of the more reactionary elements in Hollywood to keep working. But he was disgusted with it. And this film, The Asphalt Jungle, we do have, I mean, a lot of people that were impacted by the blacklist. Sterling Hayden, who was very powerful in the lead role. He became the first person appearing before HUAC when the committee returned in 1951 to hold hearings about Hollywood, to cooperate with the committee by implicating others. And he was allowed to continue his career, but he was disgusted with his behavior, regretted doing it, and never lived it down in his own mind, and tried whenever he could to help others who were blacklisted. But
Well,
that's
because Hayden's back in the news this week, as we were discussing before we went on the air, inadvertently, because of his later famous monologue in Dr. Strangelove about fluoridation of the water being a communist plot. And fluoridation of the water, sure enough, is back in the news in America this week, for better or worse.
because Sterling Hayden played the memorable part of Jack D. Ripper in that Stanley Kubrick film, and he was extraordinary in it, and many people didn't know he had it in him to do that kind of that kind of range of work. But so he's an impactful presence. You have in the role of Cobby, one of the heels that is overseeing things, the actor Mark Lawrence. He had been in left-wing, the left-wing circles, and he ended up becoming a HUAC collaborator. Or, I mean, shall we say, he cooperated with the HUAC committee in order to preserve his career. And it's an awful moment in the film because Lawrence is still working. He hasn't been blacklisted yet. But there's that really intense John Huston scene where he's being slapped around by the corrupt police lieutenant, and he weeps, when he realizes he's going to have to tell them who's in on this job. He says, "They'll call me a fink." And when we consider that Mark Lawrence had to become an informer later on, that just makes the scene even more unsettling. And then playing Louis Calhern's wife, the invalid, the woman who's bedridden, is Dorothy Tree. She also was blacklisted and had her career impacted. And we have Sam Jaffe, who plays the
safecracker.
The safecracker.
Or the mastermind of the safecracking, I guess we would say, not the physical safecracker. That's
Right.
somebody else, yeah.
He was the mastermind. He had gotten attention in the movies in the 1930s, playing the High Lama in Capra's Lost Horizon, of course playing Gunga Din for the 1939 film by George Stevens. And he is going to be blacklisted the following year after The Asphalt Jungle comes out. I believe a film that we've also talked about, the Robert Wise film, The Day the Earth Stood Still, was one of Jaffe's last films before he's not allowed to work for quite a number of years until the late 50s.
What a remarkable confluence of talent.
And I'm not
stricken down for that one
no,
film.
And there's one more to share. Co-screenwriter Ben Maddow, who adapted the W.R. Burnett novel from the previous year, was also blacklisted for his political connections, but he did end up cooperating with the committee and so that he could keep writing. But as you can see, there's a lot of political tension in the background here.
My son in high school, one of his classmates was the grandson of Ben Maddow, who knew his grandfather's history quite well. I met him once.
That's fantastic.
The young man,
film.
yeah.
But apparently, Houston was inspired by some of the Italian neorealist films by Rossellini, like Open City and Paisan, which had, of course, taken the camera into the streets
Yeah.
because there's some amazing location work.
Yeah. Well, maybe this would be a good time for us to segue to Dan. I'm going to take a quick break here, and then I'll be right back.
I've got a half an hour more to talk about here. There's so much to talk about, but we do want to hear Dan Cahill, our filmmaker and cinematographer specialist.
We will come back to this.
We will come back to this on a film that was nominated among 3 other nominations for Best Cinematography in the black and white category. Take it away, Dan Cahill.
Thank you. Thank you. One of my themes in this particular presentation is going to be, I guess I want to deal with the fact that John Huston simply tells the story with the images. I'm not going to talk too much about cinematography, which often includes lighting and camera movement. Camera placement is important here, but there is very little camera movement in this film. The scenes are mostly tableau where the story unfolds, and I'm going to deal with some of the details here. Now, this is the title shot that I always begin with, but let's look for a minute at the background of that. You can see there is a bridge in the background, which has pretty much of a straight horizon line, but the whole slope of this brick thing, it looks like it's a riverfront or something because there's a bolt right here in the foreground where you would tie up a ship. But what it tells us is that this town is out of kilter. There's something not quite right. IMDb tells me that the opening shots were shot in Cincinnati. I don't know that town well enough. I've been there a couple of times, but I'll take their word for it for now. No surprise, this is the evocative shot that the Criterion Collection selected as the cover of their DVD issue of the film. And it's just brilliant. The way we see Sterling Hayden hiding behind a conveniently located pillar to avoid a police car, it tells you the story, tells you who he is in one frame. Well, you mentioned Italian neorealism. This looks like post-war rubble. The streets are full of junk. I don't know where we are now, if we're in Los Angeles or still in Cincinnati, but it tells you that things are going wrong in this town, which is never named. This is a very busy shot. In the foreground is one of my favorite character actors, James Whitmore, and I certainly hope he was not blacklisted. I really don't know. Maybe Max or Gary could tell us. He is the crippled owner of a diner here. And there's a lot going on here. In the background, the cops are dragging Dix, Sterling Hayden's character, out of the diner, while in the foreground, Gus is just staying calm, not getting rattled, and smoking. And smoke plays an important part in movies of this era. Here is a very typical noir shot of a man with a hat, of course, walking down a dark corridor towards a light source. Speaking of light sources, there are quite a few shots in this film where you see the ceiling and you see the light sources. But what I want to call your attention to here is the fact that Gus's vest is ripped up the back. Now, that could be due to his spinal deformity, but it also says this guy is not put together very well. He's running a rundown diner, and he's about to get in a fight with this truck driver who does not like cats. This is an interesting shot, and I'll tell you why. I looked at this a couple of times, and I thought, what is that light fixture almost directly above Sam Jaffe's head? It does not look like it belongs in a room of this sort. My guess is that that is a fixture put up by the lighting crew, and the sort of white piece of cloth or transparent something, translucent, I should say, is in front of the light to diffuse the light or try and flag it off of some other surface. And it just struck me that they were in this room and Huston said, hey, I want to do a low angle shot here. And the DP, Harold Rawson, said, wait, I got a light up there. And Huston said, it's all right, it looks kind of cool. Nobody will notice. Here is our introduction to Jean Hagen as Doll, and it's very eloquent that the cigarette she puts in her mouth is bent. There's a lot of bent people in this movie, and she is one of them. Here is Marilyn Monroe, not yet fully known, which intrigues me why she got such a prominent, what's the word, prominent feature in the trailer that Max showed, because I think this movie helped put her on the map instead of her name putting the movie on the map. But anyway, this is her in a very childlike pose, sleeping on a couch under the watchful gaze of Emmerich, Lewis Calhern. This is one of the very few moments when we see anything resembling a smile on Sterling Hayden's face. And it's because he's talking about the horse farm where he grew up. And that's an important part of the story and his character. I love this moment. This is when Cobby is, and you blink and miss it, he stuffs something inside the lieutenant's coat. He's given him a bribe. We don't see it clearly. We don't know exactly what is in his hand, but it's there if you notice it. Here is Jean Hagen as Doll, looking plaintive, as always. And down the steps a bit, but she would always look up at Sterling Hayden, who is a very large man. And again, it speaks to Doll's neediness. She is really a desperate person. This is Dorothy Tree, as Max just cited, another very needy person. This is the invalid wife of Emmerich, and all she wants here is a little attention, a game of casino perhaps, but we kind of know she's not going to get what she needs. Now, part of the look of the film is wardrobe, and I just have to address something that I think it's almost laughable in this film. Every man wears a hat, and this is Anthony Caruso, who is the actual safecracker, on his back going under the electric eye, and he never loses the fedora on his head. I don't know how you would do that in real life. They must have, for the movie, used, I don't know, bobby pins or something to attach it to his head, but it's almost farcical that he has to have the hat on at every moment. This is sort of a nothing scene. This is after Dix and Doc, I guess. Yes, Dix and Doc are passing through what they call the car barn, where old train cars are parked. And I just love the ladder in the background. It just nails the composition for me. Hard to explain why, but it's a nice touch. Those of you who've heard me talk before know I love scenes where you can have two actors talking to each other, but both facing the camera. And in the foreground is John McIntyre, who I think had an entire career of playing police officers. I could be wrong, but he's always good in that. And here he is, he's busting Emmerich, Lewis Calhern. Lovely scene, beautifully shot with the two cops just hanging there in the background in case Emmerich happens to resist. Marilyn Monroe's breakdown scene, nicely handled. She showed her talents in this film. Now, this is a curious thing. This is the way we see Emmerich's suicide dramatized. And the production code said that suicide could not happen in any movie. But it was part of the story here, which is why we don't see what it is that Emmerich pulls out of his desk drawer. His shoulder is blocking that. And then we see the torn up note that he had written to his wife. And at the gunshot, the shreds of the note blow across the desk. And it's a very evocative way of saying somebody has just taken his own life. And it's how you have to get around the production code. Another shot with two people talking to each other and both facing the camera. Here, Doll is negotiating with Dix over her role in his leaving town. She will end up driving some of the time. This is a wonderful effect. This is what Doc is watching. He's watching the pretty young girl dancing in the diner. And about a second after this frame, she is going to move out of frame, and we're going to see, you can see just to the right of her face, one of the two cops who are lurking outside the window watching through the ubiquitous Venetian blinds. I kind of wondered to myself, as I often do with film noir, did every studio's carpentry department have a special room just for Venetian blinds? They were in demand, clearly. I don't know how they managed that. Here we are nearing the end, which I think is one of the most emotional and evocative in film, not just film noir, but this is the country road taking Dix and Doll back to his family farm. Here we see him going through the gate, wounded, barely alive, and we do see the name. He's staggering through the pasture towards the horses, which he talks about at other moments in the film. A beautiful shot, terrific sky. Here we see Doll, distraught over him at what his death is about to become. And the last shot, I love this, with the horses tending to him. Not sure how they got that, but it's very evocative. And as they say, it works for me. So the end of my program, gents. Max, hello again.
Dan, thank you so much for that amazing visual overview of the asphalt.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
That was really terrific.
Does anybody know about the Venetian blind department? I mean, I don't know how studios work that, but
I've never heard
all
about
had
it.
to dish them out in mass quantities in this era.
Well, every studio had its own cinematography department, which I'm sure that's where they kept all the flags that you put in front of the lights, like that amazing still you captured from the film. And
Yeah.
it had to have been Venetian blind effects that were also set up for that purpose.
Well, they were often used just to create shadows for
Exactly.
the lighting crew, but sometimes
Exactly.
they were part of the internal decor and could not be ignored. So
No, it's amazing how part of the whole filmmaking landscape they are. Just some random thoughts and please chime in anytime on this, just some things that I noticed. During the police lineup early on, you may recognize a young Strother Martin as one
Strother
of
Martin.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
later, of
What
course,
we have
famous-
here is a failure to communicate.
Right, later for Cool Hand Luke, exactly. Not everybody might understand the line early on when the police arrest Sterling Hayden, and the line is, "We'll book him on vag." They mean vagrancy, which I've always found the most offensive thing to get arrested for, not having any money on you. But that's what being arrested for vagrancy is. Uh, the writers in Houston, they get their little digs in. I mean, the police, Barry Kelly, I believe he's the commissioner, is telling the corrupt Lieutenant Dittrick that the cops, he said the cops, they'd work year over and, oh, I'm sorry, they'd work you over and you ain't the type that can take it. Believe me, you'd spill your guts in a half an hour. The idea that the police are expected to work you over when you get arrested, I mean, that's pretty dangerous. At one point, John McIntyre is the police commissioner, who says, lock up the witness, scare him worse. Once again, that's a pretty sinister look at the police who are described, I love this, they're described in the film as the happiness boys. You may remember them.
Yeah. Max, you might want to make reference to the scene you said was added to the film to promote the good work of the police. If you want to describe that.
Right. So that's the commissioner, right? And it's towards the end, as Sterling Hayden and Gene Hagen are hitting the road, you do have the scene with the police commissioner. And Gary, you can chime in more about that, where he's almost getting a plug in for the work that the police do. And that has a very, we have to appease the censors, we have to appease the studio feel to it. It kind of, because, and Gary may have pointed this out, that the W.R. Burnett novel originally had more police procedural elements in it that John Huston.
Well, it's reminiscent also the end of a film from 20 years earlier, but a very ballsy film for its time, a Howard Hawks' Scarface, produced by Howard Hughes. And there's a scene towards the end of that where there's some kind of moralistic speech by either a police commissioner or a police person of one sort or another. And ironically, the novelist W.R. Burnett, from whom this film was adapted, Was one of the screenwriters on Scarface.
It's amazing his writing credentials. He
Well,
would have been a fascinating person to have on our show.
speaking of Burnett, I think I'm quoting Eddie Muller accurately, saying that every book that Burnett wrote was optioned and adapted by Hollywood. And I don't know anybody else who has that kind of record, but I think it was our host, Laurie, was saying that he used to write a treatment, submit it to the studios, and if they liked it, he'd quick turn it around into a book and get that published.
I had heard that today, and another Eddie Muller point was he remarked on how John Huston was impressed with Marilyn Monroe because he didn't want to use her and had basically told her she wasn't suitable for the film until he saw her leave the room. And John Huston described her as one of the few actresses who can make an entrance by leaving the room.
Yes.
Because
Eddie
there was
Muller
that shot of the corridor where she goes down in her bare feet and goes into the room and closes the door. It stays with you.
Yeah.
Yes, our friend Eddie Muller described that with his customary relish, suggesting that's how she got the role.
Well, let's not forget, I believe she was introduced in Some Like It Hot, walking away from the camera on a train platform, and we got to see her lithe movements there. So
a powerful presence, absolutely. And this film ended up influencing other important heist films. I mean, it wasn't the first heist movie. There had been a few before that, but it definitely is considered one of the most amazing in the genre. It did inspire Jules Dassin's film that he made in France 5 years later, Rififi, in 1955. And also a film that we've talked about previously, Stanley Kubrick's The Killing, which also starred Sterling Hayden. They had a bit of a debt to the Asphalt Jungle.
Right, Jules Dassin, of course, he really upped the ante on the Asphalt Jungle. His heist sequence is about 20 minutes, I believe.
This one is 10, yes. And
yeah.
so Dassin added 10 minutes to it and had the audacity not to have any dialogue at all during that. But once again, there's the power of silence that you have in the Asphalt Jungle, where we mentioned there's no music. In Rififi, there's no dialogue or music during the heist sequence, which just.
But there's a lot of sound. There's a scene where they're cranking something to make a hole in a surface. And the sound of that cranking is played off of the faces of all the guys surrounding it. I mean,
this is in Rififi.
Oh, in Rififi, of course, sorry.
Absolutely. And the failed heist, the heist genre, it sort of follows that screenwriting rule that if a bunch of gangsters sit down and meticulously plan out a crime on camera, it's never going to work out.
Of course.
Because the rule is, the other option is, okay, guys, I found a way we can break into the bank, and then you dissolve to the next evening. And that's when we see them doing it. But if they're going out into grave detail or great detail, it's not going to work out as planned. And that's what I always find rather poignant about the genre.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That last scene, which you discussed so eloquently there, Dan, it's my understanding that death scene in the horse field was not in the novel. That was something that Huston
right.
and his writers devised, right?
Huston, for an industry that insisted on happy, upbeat endings, I don't know how he got away with it, because in most of the situations, there's a tremendous sadness at the end of his film. Something bad happens to someone, people going to prison, or as you see here, not surviving to the end. And his movies really are about the human condition and all its.
Or there's ironic laughter sometimes as well with Treasure of Sierra Madre, Beat the Devil, and various others.
Exactly.
Worth noting that Huston was quite the horseman himself. In his youth, he claims to have ridden with the Mexican cavalry. I'm not sure how true that is, but in his later life, he owned an estate in Ireland and managed to film many scenes from The List of Adrian Messenger on that estate so that they could stage a fox hunt. And he played the leader of the hunt. So he knew his horses. And that last scene is almost a testament to horses and their relationship to the people that they know.
Very, very well stated. And remarkably, this was refashioned by MGM on 3 occasions in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was remade as a Western 8 years later called The Badlanders. It was remade as the film Cairo in the early 60s. And then it was remade as a black action picture in 1972, Cool Breeze. So there was a bit of shelf life, longevity when it came to the film.
Talk about maxing out the licensing of a single property.
Absolutely. And getting back to some of the earlier themes about how there's a political theme running through this film that John Huston, for whatever reason, began to turn away from more in his work subsequently. You have some dialogue, like Lewis Calhern's line, "Crime is only a left-handed form of human endeavor." That stands out. And then Sam Jaffe, "Greed made me blind," which certainly captures the spirit of the post-World War II self-loathing film noir characters that often inhabit these crime netherworlds. And I think by now we are in a situation to take questions or comments from the audience. However, a reminder, those of you in New York City, this Sunday at 12:15, Gary, you are bringing an Otto Preminger noir to the cinema, and we have a special guest, don't we?
Yes, we do. A lady who's appeared on this program before, Imogen Sarah Smith, will be appearing in person at New Plaza Cinema for Otto Preminger's Where the Sidewalk Ends, one of Preminger's toughest in a whole series of tough noirs that he made from the mid-40s to the mid-50s, and starring Dana Andrews, Gary Merrill, Neville Brand, Carl Malden, about a New York City policeman who is unable to repress his sadistic impulses when it comes to interrogating suspects and getting caught up in compromising situations, and certainly a subject that's, by no means dated.
Lee, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, very, very great discussion. I'm a baseball historian who loves film. The line in the film that caught me when I saw it again last night was when Dix is dissed by one of the gang members. Says, he's too unsettled. He's like a left-handed pitcher. He's got a screw loose.
And James Whitmore says that, I think.
Maybe, yeah. I'm not sure. I think, but the reason I raise it is that Burnett wrote a book on baseball that very few people know about, called The Roar of the Crowd, Conversations with an Ex-Major Leaguer. And it came out in 64, but was based on his writings in 62 and 63. And I bring it up because I really think that ex-major leaguer was just his fictional way to hook on that book. I was wondering if any of you really knowledgeable people knew anything about that.
No.
Not familiar with that aspect of Burnett.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's I'm digging into it more, but
well, it's a very interesting period in baseball. It's a real transitional period, isn't it, from one era to another of baseball? That mid-60s, early 60s, the kind of the twilight of the Yankees dynasty, and Sandy Koufax, a lot of things going on.
Yeah, but in his case, he's such a fascinating guy. His father worked on the campaign for Cox, and so did Burnett. His grandfather was the mayor of Columbus, Ohio. So he's a real Midwestern guy who settled in L.A. after Little Caesar, but his heart was always in the Midwest, and it fuses all his books. Which reminds me, is Doll in the book? Is that her name? The way Hayden calls her, I thought it was just the way a lot of noir films refer to women as Doll, but is that really her name?
In the credits, she's identified as Doll.
She is.
The closing credits, yeah.
Yeah.
And Jean Hagen, it's worth getting a plug in for her. She had done some stage work on Broadway when MGM brought her out, just not long before this film went into production. She was in Anthony Mann's Side Street, in a memorable cameo in that. And of course, we know her most famous role of all time was as Lena Lamont in Singing in the Rain. Just a fantastic actress who was not recognized enough, or the studios didn't quite know what to do with her, and she had a rather difficult life.
And you know, Eddie Muller has mentioned more than once that she went to Northwestern, and her roommate was Patricia Neal.
Yes.
So I mean, that just blows you away.
That's a talented student body. Wow,
Yes.
that's very, very impressive. But thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Lee.
You know, what you really reminded me of one thing, that the Sterling Hayden character is Dix Handley. The same year, there's another iconic noir film with Humphrey Bogart in which his character's name is Dick Steele, and that is In a Lonely Place. Two films the same year with Dix as the lead character.
What do you
Go
say,
right
Max? Mark Butler, can you please unmute and start?
Sure. I always, well, today it just came to the conclusion that Doll was short for Dolly, but I don't know, is Dolly a proper name? Is that short for anything? But it was the safecracker who made the comment about left-handed pitchers, about hooligans. He said that's what he found in common with all hooligans, that they were cracked. They were like left-handed pitchers.
Yeah. Thank you.
One thing that really struck me about this movie was the unusual alliance between Doc Riedenschneider and Dix. You know, two very opposite kinds of people. They connected on some kind of a level, like an odd, twisted idealism of some kind, honor, you know. And I always found that to be very interesting, the relationship between the two of them and how they teamed up just in the middle of the whole heist.
Well, and that's one reason why there were so many people in positions of authority that hated these kinds of movies, because you really sympathize with and kind of respect some of these characters, and especially the Sam Jeffy character, who seems like a very dignified criminal.
Right.
You know.
And he recognized Dix, even though Dix was a crook and a hooligan, but he sensed that he had a sense of honor about him on some level, and that he could trust him. And I thought that was very, very intriguing, the way that relationship developed. And I was rooting for them. Yes, of course.
That's one of the staples of the heist film, is that the audience is always on the side of the criminals. Not 100%, but we kind of want to see them succeed. They did get away with the gems in this movie, but not very far.
Well, a good example of that is Kubrick's The Killing, where that sad ending where they're at the airport and the money goes blowing into the wind. You know, Sterling again. I felt terrible for them. At that point, all I wanted to do was get away. You know, I mean,
it's like the gold dust blowing away at the end of Sierra Madre.
Right, exactly.
Very ephemeral stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you all, by the way.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Hi, Marjorie. Can you start your audio and start your video if you'd like?
Hi, thank you. There's one few lines in the movie that I kind of had to laugh at. When they're breaking in the safe, he explodes, he spreads the liquid all around it, and the thing explodes, and the alarms go off, and he says, "Oh wow, the explosion must have set off the burglar alarms." Didn't they think that would happen? That burglar alarms would go off with the explosion? I absolutely cracked up at that they never thought of that. These masterminds, they never thought of a burglar alarm.
Well, I wonder how old burglar alarm technology was in 1949 when this was filmed. I have no idea, but it's possible it was something fairly new.
Well, not only did that alarm go off, they made mention of the fact that they assumed that alarms went off in all the surrounding buildings as well.
Yes, that's right. I mean, so they might, and these masterminds, I guess, were not very mastermind, because even if it was new, they would know about it. By the way, I thought I didn't have any sympathy for any of these characters. Like sometimes you do when they don't succeed. I thought the characters were just a bunch of hooligans who messed up. and that was it. I thought the characters mostly were one-dimensional. I remember seeing the movies, some years ago, and actually the only one I remembered was Marilyn Monroe.
How do you forget her in this, right? She steals
That's
the
right.
scenes
No, absolutely. And, just everything else, I just thought they were just a bunch of crooks and they didn't make it. Goodbye. Hasta la vista. Who gives a shit?
You have a heart of stone, Marjorie.
I don't give ice in the winter.
Marjorie, they could have used you on their job because you would have instructed them about the burglar alarm issue, and they might have succeeded. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie.
I'd have a future in bank robbery.
Absolutely. The Two for the Road discussion will be on Thursday, December 12th. It's following a day before. I'll be giving a talk called Dancing and Romancing the Films of Stanley Donen. So little holiday cheer, a little holiday music as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Gary and Dan and Laurie and everyone, and have just a marvelous Thanksgiving.
So long, everybody.